Oppressive bureaucracy is as much a part of the Imperium of Man as Space Marines, the Imperial Guard, and even the Emperor himself. It is one of the most dominant aspects of life for the average citizen. Those who are in charge of it are more powerful than any chapter master, grand admiral, or lord commander militant. The bureaucrats are in charge of the Imperium, and they have been for a long time. In this video, I want to talk about the most powerful part of the whole Imperial government, the Adeptus Administratum. I'm going to describe it as an organization, explain why it's so powerful, and how it flexes that strength across the galaxy. As always, I'll be comparing it to some real-world examples. Hopefully by doing that, we can better understand not only the lore, but our own world as well. I've used a few sources for this video. The Lexicanum is of course the main one, but I've also delved into a few novels too. They'll be mentioned wherever possible, but the Vaults of Terra series and the Watches of the Throne series, both by Chris Wright, offer a great insight into the Imperial government. If you want to learn more about the government of the Imperium, I have a primer on that which should be linked below. I want to be respectful of your time, so there are timestamps below. Please make sure to use them if you need to. But now, sit back, relax, maybe grab a snack or a drink, and let's talk about the Administratum and the impact that bureaucracy has on life, culture, and power in the Imperium of Man. The Emperor of Mankind sits atop the golden throne of Terra, where he rules the Imperium of Man, the galaxy-spanning empire that he created 10,000 years before the current setting during the 200-year-long Great Crusade. Today the Imperium consists of about 1 million worlds, spread thinly across the galactic plane. These worlds are separated by gulfs of time and space. Interstellar travel is notoriously unreliable even at the best of times, and that's without mentioning the Great Rift and the occasional warp storm blocking off whole regions of space. The Emperor too is unable to really engage with the day-to-day running of his domain. He has been kept in a state of not quite life and not quite death for 10 millennia. He will occasionally help his subjects through the use of his psychic powers, but these events are rare. How does the Imperium administer itself? How has this interstellar civilization stood the test of time? The answer, like with many long-lasting civilizations, is simple: bureaucracy. The Emperor is at the head of the Imperium, sure. Guilliman and the High Lords interpret his will and rule in his stead, absolutely. They are the decision-making part, the executive of the Imperial government. But the Adeptus Terra and the Administratum in particular are the organizations that really run the show in the Imperium of Man. Let's just take a moment to talk about the naming of these institutions. In the Imperial government, there are a number of Adepta. The singular form of this word is Adeptus. These are essentially branches of the Imperial government. The word comes from an old Latin word, spelt and pronounced the same. It means one who has achieved something. If you work for one of these organizations, you are an adept. These are usually referred to as priests by many within the setting. Like many other parts of the Imperial government, the Adeptus Terra behaves more like a monastic order than almost anything else. The Adeptus Terra is not really an organization in and of itself. It's more of an umbrella term for the Imperial government. There are organizations that are outside of its remit, but not many. The Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Mechanicus are all considered to be outside of the remit of the Adeptus Terra. The Adeptus Astartes, or the Space Marines, are only really considered to be an associated organization. Almost every other aspect of the Imperial state comes under the Adeptus Terra. But there is one organization within the Adeptus Terra that is far more important than anything else: the Adeptus Administratum. The Administratum is one of, if not the most important organization within the whole of the Imperium. Indeed, the master of the Administratum is considered by many to be the most powerful person in the Imperial government, but more on them later. The Administratum was established in the early days of the Imperium, during the Unification Wars and the subsequent Great Crusade. The founder was none other than Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right-hand man. Malcador established the early Administratum and, at least for a time, held the title of the Chief of Imperial Administration. This organization is truly massive. It's estimated that there are billions of adepts working for the Administratum in the Imperial Palace alone. Throughout the Imperium, this number would likely be much higher. Indeed, there are entire planets devoted to and run by the Administratum purely to help the Imperial bureaucracy. One of the recurring themes in the lore of Warhammer 40k is just how terrible the Administratum is at their job. They are often portrayed as inefficient, slow, and the bureaucracy itself is often purposefully overcomplicated. If you are an Imperial citizen, dealing with the Administratum is likely something you will try to avoid. Doing so can take a huge amount of time and may possibly be one of the worst experiences of your life. There are stories in the lore of people raising families while waiting in line for an important document to be signed. There are a bunch of reasons why this is the case. One of the main reasons, though, is the medium through which they conduct all their business: vellum. Vellum is a thing in the real world. It's a parchment that is usually made from the skin of calves or sheep. Famous manuscripts like the Book of Kells here in Ireland were made from this material, and there are lots of really good reasons why you would want to make stuff out of it. The stuff lasts. The Book of Kells was created in the 700s in small communities in Irish monasteries, starting on the Scottish island of Iona and finished in the town of Kells. It took about 400 baby cows to die to make the pages of this book, and the art was made in gold, silver, and various colours of ink, some of which came all the way from places like Korea and sub-Saharan Africa to small communities around Ireland over 1,000 years ago. They don't really make them like that anymore, and with very good reason. The book is one of our greatest national treasures, sure, but it's also one of the most disappointing tourist attractions in Dublin, I think, and it took about 40 years to make. As amazing a work as it absolutely is, it just doesn't make sense to take so long and devote so much time and resources to one single document anymore. In the Imperium of Man, however, they still use vellum as the main means of recording information. Strangely enough, though, even low-ranking members of the Administratum seem to be aware that there are better methods of recording information. Data slates and cogitators are still readily available throughout the Imperium. They would likely be especially common in places like Terra and to the more influential organisations like the Administratum. But vellum is considered a more secure material. Paper, regular paper, doesn't really last nearly as long as vellum, so that's not good enough to record vital Imperial records. Then there are digital threats like scrap code that have done tremendous damage to other organisations in the past, like on Mars during the Horus Heresy. Vellum is considered more secure by the priests of various Imperial Adepta. Also, it fits into their aesthetic of wanting to create a more monastic sort of vibe. Organisations like the Administratum are considered very traditional and dogmatic, even by Imperial standards. In the real world, vellum is occasionally still used for official documents. Often laws in many nations will still be officially signed on vellum parchment. This also helps GW show us, the audience, just how seriously the Imperium as a whole and the Administratum in particular take all their work. Every document they produce, every form they sign, has the same look as something like the Book of Kells or a modern law. This can help us see not only just how seriously they take themselves, but also it helps explain just why things like paperwork are so slow. There's another interesting anecdote from the Vaults of Terra novel, The Hollow Mountain by Chris Wraith. The main character, Erasmus Crowell, is pondering the use of vellum. He mentions to himself that every student in the Schola Progenium knows that by weight the 7th most valuable import to Terra is vellum. It's up there with food, water and air for how important a resource it is to the Imperial government. Some of the vellum that the Adepts will use will come from actual animals. These will mainly be pigs or porcine to the Imperium. Much of the vellum, though, will be vat-grown. There are wealthy and powerful familial dynasties that still produce the stuff. This resource is so prized by the Imperium that there have even been interagency wars fought over access to it. There's another reason why Games Workshop chose this medium for the Administratum to do their work in. It adds to the aesthetic of an endless bureaucracy where people can not just figuratively, but also literally be buried under the weight of their paperwork. All of this means that dealing with the Administratum is going to be an unpleasant experience at the best of times. Even with access to wealth and resources, you are going to struggle when dealing with the immensity of the bureaucracy. But for the average person, it's going to be much worse than unpleasant. The Administratum is essentially the civil service of the Imperium of Man. But since this is Warhammer 40k, they are a satire and a parody of the worst elements of government services and processes. We rarely like it, I certainly rarely do, but bureaucracy has always been important. It doesn't matter if you're complaining about the quality of copper in ancient Mesopotamia or applying for a passport, it's a broad term that can apply to a lot of different forms of government record keeping. In 40k, however, they've decided to parody some works of literature like George Orwell and Franz Kafka in particular. The average Imperial citizen is probably best served by avoiding any interaction with the Administratum whenever possible. Most of the times when they interact with the wider Imperium, it is to scrutinise the general populace. If an Administratum adept shows up, depending on the situation, the people nearby might get conscripted to fight in an Imperial Guard regiment and never see their home again. Or worse, they might just be liquidated to fulfill some sort of quota known only to an obscure department. Imperial citizens will almost never be given proper information as to the exact workings of the Administratum. Like in the works of Kafka, their actions can be oppressive, complex, and illogical. But there are times when people will need to interact with the Administratum. When there is a need for aid from the central government, adepts on Terra will be petitioned by the citizenry. In the novel Dark Imperium by Guy Haley, at least I think it's that novel, we can see the length that some people need to go through in order to engage with the Imperial government. There are long lines of petitioners waiting for access to the correct adepts to petition for aid in the aftermath of the opening of the Great Rift. Some of these worlds may have been long since destroyed or their causes long lost, as the petitioners were forced to wait in line. In what was probably an extreme case, we follow one petitioner through the bowels of the Imperial Palace. There, they meet literal data miners who sift through mountains of parchment to find an error, the discovery of which will grant them a reward. There are even entire societies and communities of people that have developed around these endless mountains of vellum parchment. When you read about the Administratum and people's interactions with it in particular, you are meant to be reminded of the works from authors like Kafka and also things like the Vogons from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. But what does life look like for those that work for the Administratum? Why is a job with them considered so desirable by the vast majority of Imperial citizens? One of the best and deepest insights that we get into the life of an adept of the Administratum is through the character of Fabian Gulfrain. We meet him during some of the novels in the Dawn of Fire and Dark Imperium series. After the Second Siege of Terra, the returned Primarch, Rabute Gilliman, establishes the Logos Historica Verita. This is a brand new Imperial government department whose objective is to catalogue and record Imperial history accurately. The objective is in direct opposition to other Imperial organisations like the Inquisitorial Ordo Chronos, whose stated goal is to obfuscate history as much as possible. Fabian became one of the founding members of this new organisation. This has meant that he has travelled across the galaxy with the Indominus Crusade. New exposure to different walks of life has granted him a much wider skill set, more personal wealth, and even good health. Even though being an adept for the Administratum is considered a desirable position, it still comes as a great burden, with what most people in the real world would consider to be a terrible quality of life. Adept positions are often hereditary. Fabian took his father's upon their death. We met him during his time working for the Department of Final Consideration. This is the department dedicated to receiving and processing requests for aid from all over the Imperium. The fate of billions rests in the hands of these adepts, and yet each of them must sift through what seems like countless requests each shift. Their job is endless, and though the work they do is of vital importance to many, it is monotonous, mundane, and soul-crushing. Adepts like Fabian are considered to be some of the more fortunate in the Administratum. They have access to private quarters and servants. Fabian also has access to things like natural foods, wine, and even some time during the day when he can think to himself, a rare luxury in the Imperium. What I think is one of the more interesting concepts in his story, though, is the description of the social events that his department has. There are certain days throughout the year when he and his colleagues will meet in a dining hall and have a meal. This is treated almost like a religious festival, and I imagine that many of these events would probably take place on religious festivals. But they are also reminiscent of certain traditions in organisations like the King's Inns. This is the most established legal college in Ireland, and they have trained many of the barristers in the country for centuries. They too have events like this throughout the year, where the members of the Bar of Ireland meet. By the way, barristers are the courtroom lawyers who can wear wigs if they choose. Characters like Fabian, I think, are great as an audience stand-in. Games Workshop was established as a hobby in England, and the target demographic was, for the most part, middle-class communities who had enough disposable income for their products. Their target audience hasn't really changed a huge amount. I'm sure there are similar practices for all sorts of middle-class communities in Britain to the King's Inns and the Department of Final Consideration. The work that adepts like Fabian do is not glamorous. He has to leave the Administratum to have a life that characters like rogue traders or inquisitors lead. Upon joining the Historica, Fabian is judged by other founding members, in part for being of a lower social status and not having as much experience in dealing with things like spaceflight. But the work he does is vastly more important than the life's work of many other characters that we meet. As an adept, Fabian had a vital role in considering the fates of billions of people. That's also the thing with bureaucracy like this. It can be unpleasant to deal with, especially if you spend most of your life avoiding it. When you need to use it, you probably won't enjoy it, to say the least. But for those who have to work with it day to day, unless they can find meaning in their work or some sort of life around it, after a while they're going to struggle as well. The Administratum reminds me a lot of different ways that people engage with the government. It's clearly supposed to be a satire of some of the more negative elements of the civil service system, not just in how unpleasant it can be, but also how reliable it is to work for. Among the generation who created Warhammer 40k, working in the civil service was likely one of the most stable careers that was available to them. The people who created this setting were all obviously very creative. That line of work is unfortunately, famously, quite unstable. Now, I have no way of proving this, but I would say that there were definitely a few of the early writers at Games Workshop who saw the Administratum as a sort of stand-in for a variety of general office jobs or government jobs that they were qualified to do, well able for, and probably had parents or others in their lives encouraging them to take up. This, of course, is a career that wouldn't always suit a creative person, especially not people who created a setting as irreverent and disrespectful to authority as early Warhammer 40k. Like joining the Administratum, gaining a job with certain organisations can genuinely improve one's lot in life and for the next generation. But in the Imperium at least, it is rare indeed for an individual to genuinely get a high quality of life or any sort of agency. But back to the power at the core of the Imperial government. Who runs this organisation and how does it all fit into the wider governmental structure? Let's start by going over the ranks and roles within the Administratum itself. This information is largely taken from the Lexicanum, but a lot of it is from old lore, like very old lore, so I'm not sure how accurate all of it is at this stage. Adept is the title given to all members of the Adeptus Terra, regardless of what organisation they actually work for or their rank within them. At the bottom of the hierarchy here we have subordinates, menials and ciphers. Subordinates are hereditary slaves. They act as unskilled labour in roles like engineers or craftsmen. Menials are non-specialised workers. Usually they're recruited from the non-adept population. Ciphers, however, they carry out an interesting role. They memorise information easily and repeat it verbatim when they reach a destination. They also have no knowledge of any of the information that they carry. Scribes are another grade of lowly functionary. They are responsible for record keeping. Curators maintain the records of the Imperium. Often this information is ancient, and so they require associated historical and linguistic knowledge to help them in their task. Ordinates are minor administrative officials. Prefectus or prefects are the equivalent of officers, and masters are the equivalent of department heads, with master logisticar being a more senior position still. The head of this whole organisation, however, is the master of the Administratum. This position has a permanent seat on the Council of the High Lords of Terra, such is their importance. Also, due to the number of organisations that are under the remit of the Administratum, its master is widely considered to be the most powerful individual in the whole of the Imperium. This wouldn't include people like the Emperor or Guilliman, but the amount of resources under the command of the Master of the Administratum is immense. They are one of the key directors of the Departamento Munitorum, the organisation that oversees the Imperial Guard among others. The holder of this office is considered to be the first among equals of the High Lords. But due to the commitments of being on this body, they will have very little time to devote to the Administratum. Upon ascension to the High 12, their role as an adept becomes more ceremonial than anything else. Until the end of the Horus Heresy, the Master of the Administratum was subordinate to the Imperial Regent. This was the civilian leader of the Imperium, a title held initially by Malcador the Sigillite. This title, along with its military counterpart, Lord Commander, was revived recently and is currently held by the returned Primarch Guilliman. For much of Imperial history, the Master of the Administratum was a role similar to An Taoiseach here in Ireland, or Prime Ministers in many other countries. They will act as the leader of the governing body and will tend to dictate its actions. They can, however, be susceptible to power heaves from the ranks below them. Their position is not always secure. One of the most notorious masters of the Administratum in Imperial history was Goj Vandar. He used his power to acquire another leadership position that was rivaling his at the time, Ecclesiarch, or head of the Adeptus Ministorum, the Imperial cult, basically the space pope. As head of both organisations, Vandar became a tyrant. Now, I don't actually know how this was much worse than what the Imperium already was, but I digress. He was eventually assassinated and the Ecclesiarchy was stripped of much of its power, which was returned to the Administratum. Upon return of the Primarch, the Master of the Administratum was a man called Urthu Hematalian. He was conservative in his outlook and a member of the Static Tendency. They were a faction of the High Lords that felt the Imperium was already perfect and there should be no changes to it. While this was his stated ideological reason for his later attempted coup against Guilliman, I should also mention that he was replaced as Master of the Administratum and therefore lost much of his own personal power. So too did his office. Upon their return, the Primarch was the new most powerful person in the Imperium. The current master of the Administratum is Violetta Rosscavalier. Previously, she commanded the Departamento Munitorum and was subservient to Hematalion. She was a firm supporter of Guilliman and his probably vitally necessary reforms after the opening of the Great Rift. Currently, in the Imperial government, the role of Master of the Administratum is less like on Taoiseach. That role seems to be more the Lord Regent again, with the Master of the Administratum being another governmental minister or another senior civil servant. They're still important, yes, possibly the most important person in the Imperium, barring the Emperor and the Primarch, but now there is someone above them in the Imperial organization chart when there wasn't for thousands of years. I mentioned the Departamento Munitorum as being under the remit of the Administratum, but they are far from the only one. I want to give you an idea of some of the other areas of the Imperial State that the Administratum is in charge of. I won't go into too much detail here, some of these organizations are going to have videos themselves, but I think it's still important to include them. It'll give us a sense of the huge remit of the Administratum. The Munitorum is in charge of recruiting regiments for the Imperial Guard or the Astra Militarum, equipping them and supplying them on all the war zones across the galaxy. They are regarded by most Imperial soldiers as being incompetent, but they are vital to the Imperial war machine all the same. They administer the Imperial Guard, the Ordo Tempestus, essentially a group of special forces for the Imperium, but they also do other things like they train political officers, like the famous commissars, through the Officia Perfectus. While the Munitorum is in charge of all the military aspects of the tithe, the Departamento Exacta deals with the civilian aspects. They are vital to the workings of the Imperium. Of course, like any government, where would the Imperium be without taxes? I go into more detail on the Imperial tithe in my series on the Imperial economy. There will be a link to that series in the description below. The Administratum has a similar relationship with the Imperial Navy and civilian fleet. After the Horus Heresy, the Imperial Army was separated into the Navy and Guard to avoid one individual amassing too much power, but the Administratum still has a good deal of sway over both. There are other, less well-known officios that fall under their remit too, like the Agricultae and Medicae. I think I'm pronouncing those ordos correctly, I'm not sure, but at the end of the day, who knows what areas of the Imperium they could possibly deal with. There are really too many different sub-ordos to mention. This video just turned into me listing off even more of a wiki than I'm close to comfortable with. Many of these sub-organizations are only mentioned once or twice in the whole of the lore. They are really there more to move the plot forward in whatever story we're getting. They are also there as part of the Administratum to help add to the overall vibe and aesthetic of the Imperial government. It's overly bureaucratic. Some of these organizations are no longer needed, but they exist out of pure ideology and tradition. It barely works. Errors are made all the time, and countless worlds don't receive the aid they need, even when their missives for assistance finally make it through the warren of lines and paperwork on Terra. But at the end of the day, the Administratum does one thing very well. It is there to make everyday life in the Imperium as soul-crushingly mundane as possible, and to keep the Imperium going. It also always makes us as an audience appreciate the lives and hardships of the ordinary and extraordinary Imperial soldiers even more as they fight the seemingly endless and eternal conflicts that beset the Imperium of man. So to conclude, most people hate dealing with bureaucracy. I certainly do. But to be fair, in the real world, there is a reason for it. You need to have some way to interact with the state. And of course, more importantly, the state needs to have ways of taxing you. I'm sure there are plenty of stories that we could all give about dealing with terrible bureaucracy. I remember having to go to the old passport office in Dublin. They've reformed the system since, thank God Almighty. It now actually works really well, but I still have vivid memories of the place. Bureaucracy, after all, is not just about the paperwork, it's a reflection of the culture that it administers. In the Imperium, they are literally weighed down by it, because everything in the Imperium of man is supposed to be oppressive and repressive. It's part of the fun of the setting. I remember my country being much more inefficient than it is now. These days, however, whenever I interact with the government, it's much easier. Rarely ever great, but far more improved. If you want to share a story that you have with dealing with this sort of thing, positive or negative, please do in the comments below. I also hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure to like, share and subscribe. Also hit the notification button to know when the next upload is coming out. But once again, thanks a million for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.